Flynn, and Kugler. We practice elder law and intellectual property, including patents, trademarks, and copyrights. If you would like to patent your idea, please contact our Fort Lauderdale office for a free consultation. Call 954-563-4814. That's 954-563-4814. Or visit us online at oltmanpatent.com. That's OLTMANPATENT.com. Spokesperson, not an attorney. The opinions expressed on the preceding sponsored program were strictly those of its hosts, guests, and callers, and not necessarily those of this station, its staff, management, or sponsors. The content of the following program, including all statements from the host and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material from this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. Welcome to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese, who brings you all the latest news in the legal world. Jeff will be discussing a variety of legal topics with experts in the field. If you would like to ask a question or share a story on the air, please call toll-free 888-565-1470. Once again, that's 888-565-1470. Now, let's talk legal with Jeff Van Treese.
Good evening and welcome to another edition of Talk Legal. I'm your host, Jeff Van Treese. I'm an attorney with the law firm Flynn, and Kugler, where we practice intellectual property law, including patents, trademarks, and copyrights. You can check us out online and view all our archived episodes of this show on our website at oltmanpatent.com. That's OLTMANPATENT.com. My guest this evening is going to be joining us over the phone. His name is Zach Ludens. Zach is an attorney with the law firm Carlton Fields in Miami. He practices commercial litigation, and one of his areas of interest is laws and regulation affecting drones. And this is quite topical considering the story last week involving the wildfire in San Bernardino, California. So I'd like to welcome my guest, Zach Ludens, to the show this evening. Zach, can you hear me?
I can, Jeff. How are you doing tonight?
Thank you so much for joining us, Zach. I'd like to just get your thoughts on this recent development last week. It happened along Interstate 15 involving, it was a wildfire that spread over about 3,500 acres, and it resulted in 64 vehicles being totally burnt to a crisp. Fortunately, there were no lives lost, but this was a major issue with drones because there were people that were trying to fly drones in order to capture this event on film. The problem is that it interfered with rescue choppers that were being sent out to put out the flames, and this delayed the process by between 15 and 20 minutes. So although there was no loss of life, thankfully, this could have been an issue, and it's called into question the state of the law as it is now with respect to drones. So I'd like to get your thoughts on that with respect to your expertise in this area.
And, you know, that's interesting that you bring that up, that specifically what you're talking about is, I think it was a handful, they're saying anywhere from about 5 to 10 drones that they had in the area at the time. And very interestingly, none of these that I've seen or heard anything on were actually commercial drones. These were, from what they're releasing, they believe that these were all just hobbyists out flying their drones. You know, and this is, you can put that in contrast with the possibility of a CNN or MSNBC, someone like that that's trying to use the drone to report on this wildfire itself, as where they think that these were just all hobbyists out flying their drones, you know, trying to get a better view of it. And they actually said that a couple of the drones followed the responding choppers and aerial vehicles back to the airports where they were going to land after they had kind of, you know, given up after that 15, 20 minutes. So this brings a lot of different issues to play. And like I said, the biggest thing is that these were, in fact, if these were, in fact, hobbyists and not commercial drone operators, this is completely outside the realm of what a lot of the regulations that are being promulgated right now would even address.
If you could give us an overview of what those regulations are, what are the laws on the books with respect to drones, both with respect to hobbyists as well as commercial use of drones?
Yeah. So, as you know, the FAA largely has preempted the field when it comes to regulating the safety of the national airspace. And what the FAA is currently working on, that they released in early February, is some regulations that apply to what will be small-scale commercial drones. And these are drones that are weighing 55 pounds or less, and they are essentially, the typical drones that you could buy from Amazon that you can find right on the internet. These are the type of drones that they're really targeting, because these are the ones that there have been the most interest in by commercial groups so far. And on top of this, the FAA has taken hundreds of regulatory actions, granting exemptions. That right now, the way that the current law is structured, until these new drone regulations are in place, any commercial use of drones, absent an exemption from the FAA, would be restricted. And so that's why, like I said, going back to what we were talking about with that California wildfire, even what the FAA is looking at, they are only looking at it from the commercial standpoint. And there are questions of, could the FAA even try to regulate commercial drone users? Or is this something that would be best left to the states? And if so, how will that fit into the regulatory framework that the FAA is constructing for commercial drone usage?
So is all the regulation right now at the federal level? There's no states or municipalities that have enacted any sort of regulation?
A lot of what the states and municipalities have enacted so far has been privacy statutes. For instance, in Florida a couple months ago, the governor signed an expansion of the Freedom from Unwarranted Surveillance Act that was enacted a couple years ago. When it was first enacted, it was meant so that law enforcement agencies couldn't be flying drones and kind of surveilling suspects without any sort of warrant. Since drones have started now being used more widely commercially, as well as individually through hobbyists, they have expanded these laws to apply to individuals. California has actually proceeded under their paparazzi statute that they had on the books. Florida has one of the newest laws. Texas was one of the first states and has one of the most strict laws. And then you have other states like New York that have largely left that privacy question unaddressed and have kind of just left it under the existing statutes that you could use for any sort of invasion of privacy.
So in certain states like New York and other states that haven't adopted more stringent regulation, you could conceivably fly a drone over somebody's backyard and film them in what would appear to be a private setting, and they might not even know they're being filmed.
And that also brings up an interesting question that I had been thinking about for some time, and some states have started to take action on. Of when you're talking about flying over someone's property, what does that really mean? Where does your property right end when it's going vertically? At common law, there was this concept that you owned everything from heaven to hell, meaning that you owned all the way to the center of the earth and you owned all the way till the top of the sky. In today's modern society, no one questions if a commercial jet flying 30,000 feet above your home is trespassing. We just assume that your personal property rights have ended. But some states, and Nevada is one of the ones most recently to do this, have actually set where you would be trespassing over someone's property using some sort of unmanned aerial vehicle, or even presumably if you're using a manned aerial vehicle.
So this is an interesting topic because it also ties in with potential police use of drones. Because when you look at the Fourth Amendment says that you have a right to be secure in your house, and the Supreme Court has ruled that you have more privacy if you are in an area, even if it's open space, so long as it's fenced in. And so now that we're seeing more drone use, it could be that right to privacy will slowly be eroded.
Well, and so, like under Florida's act, they've actually used that same reasonable expectation of privacy standard that comes out of the Fourth Amendment. It comes out of, the jurisprudence on the Fourth Amendment, such as Kylo and Katz, that, where is your reasonable expectation of privacy? And some states have given a little bit more explanation, and, I've looked at the legislative history, the committee reports behind some of these things, that they're saying if you're on a street and you're using a drone for something that you can see from the street with some sort of unaided view, that's not going to be infringing someone's reasonable expectation of privacy. But let's say that you're seeing something that you could only see if you were on a stepladder, or that you could only see with some sort of telephoto lens. Then you're getting into a range where you may be violating someone's reasonable expectation of privacy.
Well, that could include, for example, satellite imagery. If satellites can actually see individual people and their activities in their backyard, then even though that's much higher than the commercial jet, it still potentially could be an invasion of privacy.
And, that brings up a good point that some of these, such as Florida's, is, not necessarily limited to drones, as where other states such as Texas, it's a lot more limited as to what it's covering. And like I said, California used their paparazzi law. New York is just using basic tort doctrine so far. That these are all things that, theoretically getting into that, you could, but these are raising other large issues as well, and this is what a lot of my interest has been in, is how do you actually know that someone is doing this? If you are just walking down the street and you see a drone fly over you, if it's high enough up, you're not going to be able to see if it has a camera. It may not have a camera. It may be someone just standing on the ground watching it and flying it. Other states, such as Florida's, actually talks about recording an image. Does that mean that they have to be actually recording the video, or is that live stream back to the device considered enough of a recording in the same sense? You do intellectual property law, copyright, where it has to be a fixed performance. They've come up with exceptions for that when you're broadcasting it over the airway, it's fixed long enough to still be a copyrightable performance. So you have all these different things that are coming into play, but then you also live in the U.S. Kind of litigious realm where individuals can sue people for whatever they want largely. And, just because a law is ultimately going to protect you and because you won't ultimately be violating that law doesn't mean that you're not going to be getting sued for this and that you're not going to have to be incurring these defense costs along the way.
This brings up an interesting issue also. You mentioned the press and paparazzi issues, because that brings in the First Amendment, which always comes up with paparazzi activity. And the general rule is that applicable laws that don't otherwise violate the First Amendment, that are just generally applicable to the public, also apply to the press in search of news. And so you can't say, well, if you're harassing someone or following them around, but if you're holding a camera, then it's constitutionally protected. That argument doesn't work. It's going to be interesting to see if similar arguments are made with respect to drones. Now you won't need paparazzi photographers. You can just take drones and have them follow celebrities around as they walk around their public areas, and they can say what, and the paparazzi could potentially say, well, this is a public space, we have a right to film here, but that's not exactly clear, because the effect of the harassment might be much greater if a person literally can't walk free anywhere any minute of the day.
Well, and some of that is addressed in some of these state privacy laws that, like Florida's talks about you have to be on privately owned real property to have that reasonable expectation of privacy from a drone. So, what you're talking about there, if someone is in a public park and someone is just flying a drone around following them, you probably don't have that reasonable expectation of privacy under that statute. But there, again, is where we go to, you're putting this regulatory scheme on top of what's already existing, and you look at a state like New York where they're just essentially leaving in place what was already there from the common law, and nothing is to say that just because someone isn't violating that particular drone privacy statute doesn't mean that somebody else isn't going to bring a claim for invasion of privacy under that common law tort doctrine.
It's going to be interesting because there's going to be gray areas with respect to the amount of surveillance that's going on or the amount of following someone around. So it's going to be interesting to see how things develop because this is such new technology. There was a recent news story just today that I saw on CNN about a student that made a video for his high school class where he had a drone that was firing a pistol in a wooded area on private property, so it didn't violate any laws. There was no safety issues. He was just firing it at a target, but it showed a drone that was firing a pistol, and it was broadcast on YouTube and got a lot of hits. And this is something that the FAA is now looking into and law enforcement's looking into, but the position that law enforcement in the area took is that he wasn't violating any laws. There's no laws on the book that's being violated here. What are your thoughts on that? Because if these drones could potentially become weaponized by being just rigged by citizens, these are just existing drones. These are not weaponized drones, but they're potentially being tinkered with. They could potentially become deadly weapons.
Well, that goes back to the beginning part of our discussion where, this is going to be, I'm suspecting anyway, that no commercial company is going to be wanting to do this. So this is going to fall outside that realm of what is currently being regulated by the FAA. But, we're also talking here, I saw that same story from what I remember seeing about it. What he was using wasn't that large of a drone. So, it's not like we're talking military type Predator drone that could be, thousands of feet in the sky doing this type of thing. So, we are going to have all of those interesting questions. And then you also get into, someone that I saw kind of analogize this to, hunting from a helicopter, which is legal in some states such as Texas, that people do, hunt wild game from helicopters. And, how is this different than that other than the fact that there's some sort of remote system involved and that you aren't the one pulling the trigger? And so, there are a lot of questions that are going to come in from that. Ultimately, this is one person that was doing this as part of a school project or, claiming that that's what it was being done for. And, other people may choose to do that same thing. But at the end of the day, the FAA is largely looking at this, and from what Congress has told the FAA to do, is more trying to figure out how do we get these commercial drones into the sky. If we have hundreds of companies that have looked for exemptions, in some of the different things that I've written and read, you're talking about tons of different industries where this could be applicable. One of my favorite jokes to make to people is, when they say, like, what would someone use a drone for? It's like, how Jimmy John's wants to be so fast with delivering their subs. Well, what about when traffic is bad and they just fly a drone and drop the sub in your hand instead of a guy having to ride a bike through the area? That there are potential applications for this that are endless. You look at construction companies that could use drones in order to monitor very large construction sites. Instead of having people rappel up and down the sides of buildings to do inspections, you can fly a drone there and have a lot less risk involved. You look at energy companies that have talked about using drones to monitor oil pipelines, that you can fit the drones just like this individual decided to fit the drone with a pistol. You can fit the drones with special infrared cameras that you're going to be able to see different heat signatures, such as, that's one thing that the Border Patrol was using drones for along the southern border was that they could use the heat sensing capabilities of these thermo sensing devices on the drones to be able to see, has there been soil that's recently moved, and all that kind of stuff. If you equip that examining a pipeline, you may be able to tell where a trouble spot is in a pipeline before something bursts in a way that someone just walking the pipeline or driving the pipeline may not be able to do. And ultimately, when we're talking about these things, we're talking about a lot bigger and more sophisticated drones than what this one student was using, which was a fairly benign small drone that this was fit onto. So at the end of the day, we are going to have those types of consequences as well, but as drones get incorporated into the airspace, you're going to see a lot more helpful uses for them than, for some guy to be fitting a pistol onto it.
Could you see the FAA or the government or the federal government potentially prohibiting the weaponization of drones by private citizens? I mean, that seems like that might be a response to this.
That's a potential response to it. You get into the same questions of, does the FAA or the federal government have that authority to be, constitutionally, do they have that authority to be using some sort of police power in that way? And that's one of the reasons I think that the FAA is so far really focused on this commercial side, because they do have that power under the Constitution. And so what I think is more likely to see is states taking some sort of action on this, because they know that the states are largely going to have this sort of general police power, as where if the federal government tries to do that, or any sort of regulation that gets into those areas, there are ultimately questions of whether or not that could stand.
I mean, this is a concern because this high school student could weaponize a drone, then you could certainly imagine somebody weaponizing drones and then using that as a homemade home security device. And if I'm walking my dog next to my neighbor who has a weaponized drone that malfunctions, that's something that I'm going to be very concerned with. And that might be a situation where regulation is needed. As it stands now, there isn't any regulation on point for that.
Well, I mean, I'm thinking back to when I was in law school. I remember reading a case in torts class about a trip gun. I believe it was out of Iowa that everyone ends up reading in their first year torts class, where an individual set up a trip gun as a home security device, and that trip gun shot someone and caused them great injury. And, you get back to the same doctrines that are on the books, and just because we don't have an explicit law saying that these things can't be done doesn't mean that you're not going to find a cause of action to bring that claim under if something like that were to happen.
There'd be a cause of action, but of course, once the person gets shot, then it would be too late, and that might it might require that there be laws on the books to prevent it from happening in the first place, rather than simply have a cause of action that after the injury occurs, you could be sued. But it's going to be very interesting to see how this develops, because we really are breaking new ground with this technology. It's something that the law and certainly the Constitution really doesn't have any way to grapple with at this point until new law is made. I'm wondering what your thoughts are with respect to the wildfire issue and with respect to rescue choppers and situations like that are unable to fly in the event that you have an emergency, because it seems like you could equip these drones with a chip that could disable the use of these hobby drones or even commercial drones in the event that you have an emergency. It could have a chip that would have a GPS signal that could localize the disability of these devices within the area where an emergency is taking place. It seems like that might be a reasonable step to take.
Well, and, so another thing, going back to our discussion about the current FAA regulations, is what the FAA is currently looking at regulating are these drones that are 55 pounds or less. And one big impact of that is, and this is something that a lot has been written on, is that the FAA is currently looking at requiring visual line of sight. And that matters in this context because when you're talking about these smaller drones, there's only so much capability that these can have. While you do have that individual that mounted a pistol on one, these drones aren't necessarily as sophisticated as the multi-million-dollar ones that can fly hundreds of miles at a time. They don't necessarily have the capability to have systems on them that can detect incoming objects. Which is something that larger drones do have the capabilities of. Part of this is cost-wise. Part of it is that some of these systems just simply weigh too much to be able to put on one of these small drones.
Could you just clarify real quick, Zach, what you mean by the line of sight requirement?
The line of sight requirement is that on these 55-pound and less commercial drones, you're actually going to have to be able to see the drone operating at all times. You can't necessarily have a guy who's flying it with someone else walking under the thing or driving under the thing, that it would have to be the pilot able to see the drone at all times while operating it.
And the drones themselves are made so that it would become inoperable if the person was not within the line of sight.
No, the drones don't have that capability. That's going to come in from any limits on the wireless technology that's being used to operate these drones. That you can buy one on the internet that you operate through Bluetooth from an iPhone, versus you buy others that use much more sophisticated radio frequencies. You get into some of these more commercial ones may even be bouncing off of satellites to operate them. But that goes back to your point about during an emergency. You could envision a situation in which someone is using some sort of almost radio frequency jammer to shut down anything like this that is happening. And when you look at some of the more sophisticated drones, they have capabilities built into them so that when the drone loses radio connection with its source point, they will actually retrace their steps and fly back to where they took off from. That's in a situation like that would be the ideal scenario where, these are all sophisticated drones that do have those capabilities, that if you ran some sort of radio frequency jammer to do something like that the drones could turn around and fly home to where they came from.
Zach, I think we have about a minute left, or about 30 seconds left. I just want to make sure you have a chance to give out your contact information to our listeners.
Like you said at the beginning of the show, my name is Zach Ludens. I practice complex commercial litigation with Carlton Fields, Jordan Burt in Miami, Florida. And if anyone has any questions and wants to talk about this further, I can be reached at zludens@csjblaw.com.
I'd like to give a very special thanks to my guest, Zach Ludens. This is Jeff Van Treese for Talk Legal. Please tune in next Tuesday evening from 6 to 6:30 for another edition of Talk Legal. This is Jeff Van Treese. Thanks so much and have a great evening.
Thank you for listening to Talk Legal with Jeff Van Treese. Tune in next week for more insightful and exciting information about the law. You can contact Jeff by email at jvt2law@gmail.com or give him a call at 561-789-6866. That's 561-789-6866. The content of the preceding program, including all statements from the host and guests, is to provide general information and commentary about the law. Under no circumstances does any statement made by a host or guest to a caller or listener constitute legal advice or the formation of an attorney-client relationship, and the material of this program should not be viewed as a substitute for personal consultation with an attorney. The opinions expressed on the preceding sponsored program were strictly those of its host, guests,